Hi everyone, and welcome back to Tirtzu Zionist Salon. I'm pleased to be joined today with Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch. Hi Maurice, how are you?
Hi Tamir, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. For those of you who don't know, Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsch is a 19-year veteran of the IDF. He served in numerous senior positions in the MAG, including the Chief Military Prosecutor for Judea and Samaria. Today, he works in the Palestinian Media Watch, an amazing organization which helps expose really all the incitement that goes on in Palestinian media. Now, Maurice, first of all, I have many questions I'd like to ask you, but I'd like to ask really, first of all, about your role as Chief Prosecutor for Judea and Samaria. You know, this is a big role, a lot of responsibility,
Yep.
And you were doing this role for how many years?
I was the head of the prosecution for almost 3.5 years, from
Wow.
March 2013 through December, really November 2016.
Mm-hmm.
An intensive period of time,
Exactly.
an intense period of time.
Crucial time.
Really with everything going on with the knife intifada on the one hand that started in 2015, the kidnapping and murder of the three boys in Gush Etzion in June 2014, the return of the terrorists who had been released in the Shalit deal, which was my initiative to bring them back into prison after the kidnapping. Really a phenomenal period of time.
Can you tell me more about what your role really entailed?
So the role of the head of the prosecution is really directing all of the law enforcement against Palestinians in Judea and Samaria as regards predominantly security offences, terrorist offences. We're talking about everything from stone throwing through murder, mass murderers, and along the way you have this amazing chance to shape and develop young officers in the IDF, your prosecutors, my staff, who are just amazing. They're 21-year-olds who have just come out of high school, they've gone straight to university, and now have come into the army to do their military service. And you get to shape the way that they approach the profession of being a prosecutor, approach the way of being an officer in the army in general. They're young people doing tremendous work for the security of the Strait of Israel.
Yeah. And you were describing your role. Does this count for both Area C, B, and A?
So yes, because the court predominantly deals with security offences, with terrorism, there isn't really a distinction between A, B, and C. It's terrorism wherever it happens, whenever it happens, including if, for example, you have a terrorist who is planning a terrorist attack, planning a car bombing in one of the neighborhoods of Ramallah. So it's unreasonable to think that we would have to wait until he leaves Ramallah. Maybe we'll catch the car, maybe we won't catch the car. If you can arrest the terrorist already at that stage, then you go in and do it. And that's our duty and our responsibility to actually carry out those arrests and to prevent terrorism.
I want to jump to your personal story first of all. You know, I can't help but hear that you have a South African accent, I believe. Can you tell me more about how you came to Israel in the first place? What really your personal story was before, you know, these significant roles you took in the, Chief Military Prosecution for Judea and Samaria? And, you know, how does a, South African really come to Israel?
Farm boy.
And exactly, and find himself really Chief Prosecutor, yeah.
So really, I was born in a smaller farm town in South Africa. My father had moved to South Africa to join his aunt, who had also moved there from England. My mother got married and had 3 children. From there, we moved to Pretoria. From Pretoria, we moved to South Africa after my parents were involved in all types of illegal relationships with people of color in South Africa. We're talking about 1981. Apartheid was still relevant. My mother had been working for Nelson Mandela at one stage. So once they were arrested, my mother decided, fine, it's time to leave. And we moved to England. In England, I went to Jewish day schools, schools for Jews rather than Jewish schools. And at age 13, I came to Israel. I went to the Jewish free school, to JFS in London. And at age 13, I came to Israel for 5 months with my school. Fell in love with the country, with the people, with everything about it, and decided this is the place that I want to be in life. And that's what I then focused everything to realize that goal. At age 18, after I finished high school, I came to Israel for a year, just volunteering programs. We spent a few months in Ashkelon teaching English in schools with Project Renewal and things like that. A month up north on Moshavim doing the same thing. Relatively a few months on a kibbutz Solalim. Nice. And then 3 months finishing it with an army program, Marova, which is still going on to this day. And then I went back to do my law degree. As part of my law degree, I spent every summer here. As part of my degree, I had a year working, which I also spent here. And so once I finished my law degree, I made Aliyah.
You knew that was coming, right?
This was coming all the time. Yeah. From age 13, it was very clear that I will be living in Israel. That was the goal.
Incredible.
That's Zionism.
And it's an incredible story. And I couldn't help but notice that you were mentioning that it wasn't Jewish school, but it was more of a school for Jewish boys or Jews. Yeah. Can you elaborate on that? Like, how come?
So in England, you have lots of Jews who aren't necessarily religious, aren't necessarily particularly affiliated. My family isn't religious, although I'm now today religious. Yeah. My family isn't religious. That's not my background. And so we went to schools which had a Jewish orientation, schools where at the time only Jews went to those schools.
But it was sort of a secular orientation.
But it's a secular education, just in a school for Jews. So there are additional things that you learn, possibly Hebrew instead of only learning French or German. Yeah. A 5-month trip to Israel, obviously, is something which is something not very common in other schools in England, to say the least. And obviously Jewish studies. But the Jewish studies side was unfortunately very, very small within school.
And did you know this is something that you wanted to do already back then? When you first fell in love with Israel and you knew that was what you wanted to learn, did you see yourself in a similar role to being chief prosecutor?
Absolutely not. When I made Aliyah, even though I'd already finished my law degree, my idea was to join the army and to be a tzadchan, to be a paratrooper. Who doesn't want to jump out of a perfectly good plane for no good reason? But that wasn't to be the path. I only had to do, I made Aliyah specifically at the age of 23 to avoid the cutoff, which was 24 at the time, to make sure that I had to do a full compulsory service. Well, but even then it was only a year. And so it wasn't long enough to go into the path of the paratroopers. So after a while running backwards and forwards, the army eventually said, you know what, you're a lawyer. Well, actually, I said more to the army than they said to me. But I said to them, listen, I'm a lawyer. I think it'll be good if I go into the military advocate general. And after a long story, which I'll make very short, I found myself in that unit.
Not bad.
It was fabulous. It was definitely the greatest opportunity that I could have been given to use my skills, my skill set, my Zionism, to promote things which I thought were definitely important.
Completely. So I really wanted to touch on that. As an attorney, we know, just like in Tirtzu, you give a lot of legal assistance and legal representation to bereaved families. Can you tell more about that? What does your activity really entail or involve? For example, you're probably familiar, but we have the Choosing Life Forum for Bereaved Families, which we really accompany, through different, legal discussions, court rulings and things like that. Can you tell us a little about more what it means, really, from your position to be assisting them? And maybe even more importantly, why do bereaved families, Israeli bereaved families, need legal representation in the first place?
So really the story starts many, many years ago. In 2003, I joined the prosecution for the first time, moving from the legal advisor for Judea Samaria. And at the time, we were dealing with a tremendous amount of terror attacks that had taken part as part of the war that started in September 2000. Yeah. And we would often hear a complaint from the victims of terrorism that they had no idea if the terrorists involved in attacking them and murdering their loved ones had ever stood trial, what happened to them, what rights they had, if they had any rights. They would hear generally via the press that some terrorist was now sentenced to X amount of life sentences for carrying out the terror attack in which their loved ones were killed. And suddenly we would get a flood of phone calls. Well, why didn't you tell me? And that was something which was very symptomatic of the prosecution for Judea and Samaria. We didn't really have enough manpower to deal with the cases that we were dealing with. We had even less time to accompany the victims of terrorism and keep them informed. In Israel, that was a relatively new subject at the time. The prosecution, the civilian prosecution, was now subject to a new law of the rights of the victims in criminal procedures, and special positions were set up in the prosecution and within the police in order to keep the victims informed. We didn't have access to any of that, to any of those resources, and so we were just the source of complaints and justified complaints that the victims and their families weren't involved. When I came back to be the head of the prosecution, I said that this is not going to happen to me anymore. We still didn't have the resources. We were still overworked. But I decided as a personal decision that I would meet with the families of every victim before we put in an indictment to court. They would not be surprised by... There had been a change also in the media from 2003 to 2013. It became much quicker and much more involved in internet and everything. So I said, no longer will victims hear of an indictment being submitted via the media. And it's something which I took upon myself and really forced upon the entire unit, which wasn't interested in it, didn't want it, didn't have the resources ready to handle it. But it was something which was personally important to myself. And then when I retired, I said that I have this tremendous amount of knowledge of the workings of the military courts, which not so many lawyers have. Yeah. And I have this affiliation and really identification with the victims of terrorism. So how can I best help them? Just volunteering my time to accompany them through the process. It's not really representing them. I don't carry out the function of a regular lawyer. They don't really. There's no specific legal advice that I'm particularly giving them, but rather just directing them and holding their hands through the criminal process. For 99.99999% of the victims, the criminal procedure in general, definitely the criminal procedure in the military courts, is something which is completely foreign to them. They've never stood in front of a court. They've never been exposed to this. They see, obviously, television, but real life is a little bit different from television, obviously. And so they just need to know what's going on. What are their rights? When can they speak? When can they be present? What's happening in this whole, really, sometimes, unfortunately, the right word and only word for it is circus that is going on in front of you, of the judge sitting and talking to the defense lawyer, and the prosecution's giving their little bit, and really you have that triangle or square if you include the defendant, and the families are not part of that discussion. So what role do they play? And suddenly they're talking about the families and the victims in the third person. But it's my loved ones. Exactly. And you need someone to just be there to help explain to them what's going on. What's the next hearing about? When is the next hearing? These people are also to work with the press. These people have a very little press exposure before that. And now the press is chasing them everywhere. So someone needs to just help them with those types of aspects. There are specific legal things within the process that I help the victims with. But that's really the sideline. It's more just giving them information, empowering them in a situation where they are powerless, where they're victims, and just making sure that they're not victims all the way through.
Sounds really noble, to be honest. But I have to ask.
It's not so noble. They're really the ones that give tremendous strength. I'm just a lawyer using my skills that I've learned. They are tremendously inspirational.
But I have to ask, I mean, it sounds like, obviously these people, the bereaved families, of course, they didn't mean to get involved in all these like legal discussions and, court rulings. But would you say, by helping them and really giving them certain advice, would you say they're participants in, for example, court discussions is of some help to what the ruling would be? Does it affect the court ruling through the media or just directly through, with the judges? I mean, is it something that we actually want to promote?
So there are different things that happen during the course of the trial for which the participation of the bereaved families is unfortunate, and I tell him this as part of the explanation. Yeah. They are completely superfluous. Their presence has no influence whatsoever on the final decision. Unless they were present at the scene of the crime, then really they have nothing to contribute to the decision of the judicial decision as to guilt or innocence. That's the evidence that the prosecution presents to the court, as you see on television. Really, that's the process. But there are certain junctures within the process where the family can have an influence. For example, we had one case where the family, obviously the hearing set, myself and the family turn up for the hearing. The lawyer doesn't turn up. The lawyer doesn't turn up, he's late. So the judge initially decides, well, you know what? I'm here all day, the prosecution's here all day. The defense lawyer is one of the regulars here. He'll come in. So we'll just put off the hearing for another 3 hours and then we'll reconvene. I cannot explain the ignorance of that judge. Yeah. The family's there waiting. I'm there waiting. For what? They're just going to sit and wait for 3 hours because the lawyer doesn't give a damn about the court, insults the court, doesn't turn up on time when he's meant to come, and the judge just agrees to be a vassal in the hands of the defense lawyer. That was something that I stood up and said, with all due respect to the judge, that's not an acceptable decision. You made a decision. You decided that the hearing would be at a certain time on a certain day. Everybody is here. If the defense lawyer didn't turn up, then he should be fined for not turning up. I and the family should not become hostages of the defense lawyer that turns up whenever he decides.
Makes perfect sense.
And so that's places where the family can influence the decisions. In cases of murder, for example, the families have very little influence on the final sentencing. The final sentencing in these cases, since Israel doesn't use the death sentence, is normally a life sentence. And that's generally what's going to happen, whether the family are there or not. But the idea of victim participation in the whole criminal process is something which, aside from terrorism, is something which is very much developing in the criminal procedures. And in case of terrorism, it is incredibly therapeutic.
I believe so, yeah. Okay, so let me ask you this. From, all the, God forbid, families you've assisted, and from all the cases you came across, what was the most unbelievable or astonishing, hard to believe, case or incident that you came across as chief prosecutor, of course?
So really you have both sides, or three sides, from the Palestinian side as the terrorists, dividing it between the cases where young girls, predominantly young girls, who have been abused at home, suddenly pick up knives and come and try and kill Israeli soldiers.
Oh, wow.
Some of them just want to go to jail. It's safer for them in jail than it is in their home environment. And so then sad. Into that story, they get the glory of being a girl who attacked an Israeli soldier. They're glorified all over the press. They become the darlings of the left-wing organizations, the Israel-hating organizations, B'Tselem and others who, how can the Israeli prosecution, how can this evil prosecutor, Maurice Hirsch, prosecute this little young girl, Malik Khatib was her name? How can they prosecute her for she's just a little girl, but she's a little girl who came to murder someone. Yeah. And that's why she gets prosecuted. So you see that the terrorists, some of them, are simply victims of their own environment, and sending little girls out to do acts of terrorism is just despicable. But we've seen that over and over again. Previously, not as the head of the prosecution, I dealt with the case of a 13-year-old who was dressed by a terrorist in a suicide belt and sent to blow himself up.
Wow!
Like, what do you do with that? The kid's 13. In court, there's the dock where the defendant sat behind it. He stands up. The judge says, "Stand up." He says, "I am."
Wow.
And it's just sad on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have the monsters, the monsters who come in and say, had you not arrested me, I would have killed more people, and really for them,
and they feel no regret.
There's no remorse. There's no regret. For them, there is only one sentence, and it is death. It should be the death sentence. It's something that I support. When we dealt with the case of the kidnap and then murder, what it turned out to be of the three boys in Gush Etzion, I already prepared a recommendation to request the death sentence for those terrorists, because not only did they kidnap and murder 3 children, they then started an entire war. If you remember that, the kidnapping in June went on to the war in Gaza. Hundreds of people lost their lives because of those 3 terrorists. And so I thought, because their crime was so heinous, connected with the fact that they'd started an entire war, it would be relevant and pertinent to ask for the death sentence in their case. Thankfully, 2 of the terrorists were killed in an attempt to arrest them, and so it became completely moot. The third one wasn't relevant already for the death sentence, so it came. But when you see the evil of these people, it's the terrorist there that survived, Hussam Kawasme, comes from a family of terrorists. Yeah. His brother was released in the Shalit deal, previously sent to jail for being a murderer involved in terrorism. His mother helped pass on the money that they needed for the attack, which came from the brother in Gaza. The family, that terrorism is just their family business. They were a particularly violent terrorists. And you stand in court and you see these people, they have no remorse whatsoever. No remorse whatsoever. His mother came into court. She was proud of the actions of her son.
Yeah, they really believe it's the right, just thing to do, right? To murder Jews.
To murder children.
Yeah.
If they're Jews on the way. It's just unbelievable. And then on the other side, to see the victims, every one of the victims are already, the families of the victims are true sources of inspiration. Each one of them in their own way, how they deal with the loss, how they respond to the loss. It's something which I don't come from a bereaved family. I have no connection to terrorism. I haven't had even a friend that's been murdered in an act of terrorism, thank God, and I hope I never will have. But to see these people dealing with the loss, mothers of children, fathers of children, people who've lost parents, it's terrible, and just to be there as a helping hand for them is really a great sort. Yeah,
good for you. So I wanted to focus now more about, we were talking about the families of terrorists and how, it seems to me at least, a lot of it has to do with a matter of culture or education, right? Their upbringing tells them that's part of, how they can earn their respect in their society, of murdering Jews, of course. And I know you and the Palestinian Media Watch are very active when it comes to fighting the phenomenon of the pay for slay, really, of the PA, right? Can you explain a little about what this is and what do you do to fight against it?
So I'll introduce pay to slay with a story from my period as the head of the prosecution. I didn't have the name of being a particularly lenient prosecutor, let's say, with a bit of an understatement. One day I'm sitting in plea bargain discussions with one of the Palestinian lawyers. It's one of the lawyers who, this is his job. I can't say that he particularly identifies with the terrorists. It's just his job. And we're discussing a plea bargain. We discussed the contents of the indictment, obviously, and sentencing. And I said, you know what? I think that a relevant sentence would be 52 months in jail. That's what the case law says. That's a little bit of a reduction for a plea bargain. That's what I think should be the offer. He came back to me a few weeks later, and he said, my client has decided to reject the offer. And so I said, fine, you don't have to close every file with a plea bargain. Sometimes you just go to court and you have a full trial. And that's great, no problem. He said, you don't understand. My client wants 60 months in jail. And I'm looking at him and I just don't understand. And I said to him, I won't use his name not to explain it. I said, X, can you explain to me what's going on here? And he said, I can't really explain. That's just what it is. That's what he's asking for. So I said no, whatever. And that's where I ended. I left the army and I joined Palestinian Media Watch. And one of the first things that I'm exposed to is this idea of pay for slay. That according to Palestinian law, every terrorist is guaranteed a monthly salary for acts of terrorism when they're in jail. And so every terrorist really that I'd sent to jail, and I would say there's probably in the region of, including the periods that I was head of the prosecution, not personally dealing with the terrorists, somewhere in the region of, I would say 40 to 50,000 terrorists that I was involved in one way or another, at one period or another, with their prosecution and sending them to jail. Every one of them got paid by the PA for being in jail. That's something which I couldn't understand. And so the more I went into it, and I realized, well, so there's different categories of pay for slay. If you're in jail for 1 to 5 years, then when you leave prison, you get an extra bonus of unemployment for the period that you were in jail. So if you're in jail for 3 years, you get 3 years salary in jail, all types of other benefits that you get as a terrorist in jail along the way. You get a degree and everything else. Yeah. And when you leave prison, you get like a leaving bonus, incredibly. They pay you just a big lump sum of cash. And then you also get unemployment benefit for a period equivalent to the time that you spent in jail. If you spent 5 years in jail and upwards, then you're guaranteed a position ostensibly in the Palestinian Authority. And if there's no position, you just get a salary, and you're guaranteed that salary for life. Now, let's just go back to the story for a second. Why did he want 60 months in jail? Because if you're already spending 52 months in jail, you're only going to get unemployment benefits. If you've spent 5 years in jail, you're guaranteed a pension for the rest of your life.
It's unbelievable.
So you stay for another few months in jail, and your financial future is completely sorted. You take a mortgage, but someone else is paying that mortgage. It's unbelievable. If you spend more than 10 years in jail, and really that's the hardened terrorists, you're guaranteed a position, a high-paying position in the PA, with only one condition: that if they actually call you to work, you have to come. But they never call you. So you're just basically getting a huge salary for the rest of your life, simply because you're a terrorist. Now, when you add all these things up, you're making a tremendous amount of money for being a terrorist. Yeah. And the salaries go up as long as for the more time you spend in jail. So the more severe the offence is, the longer sentence you get, the more money you make along the way. And you have terrorists who come in and explain, well, I wanted to get married, but in order to get married, I have to buy a house. I didn't have enough money saved up from my first period of jail to buy a house. So what I decided was I'd come up with a plan for another terrorist attack, something that would get me between 5 and 6 years in jail. And so cumulatively, I would get to the 10 years. My fiancée would wait for me for that period of time. And you see the terrorist explaining the financial workings of why he got involved in terrorism, because of the money. Another terrorist says, well, I had tremendous debts, so I thought that I'd just commit suicide as a way to get out of my debt. And then I thought, well, what's the point of that? If I kill myself, my family are just going to be left with the debt. But if I go and kill Jews, then everyone's better off. Then everyone's better off. Yeah. And that's really pay for slay. Giving a financial incentive for terrorism, it's something which the PA has done really since the day the PA was created. It was codified in law in 2004, still under Yasser Arafat, but already on the margin, on the breach with Mahmoud Abbas. It is Mahmoud Abbas, this so-called moderate, who is responsible for twice raising the salaries paid to the terrorists. Wow. Once in 2006 and again in 2011. That pay for slay is Mahmoud Abbas's only legacy. He is a failed leader. He hasn't brought peace. He hasn't improved the lives of the Palestinians. His only legacy,
it's not even chosen, right?
Is paying terrorists to murder Jews. That's Mahmoud Abbas's legacy. And that is why he goes on Palestinian television, and now they're showing a clip over and over again in which Mahmoud Abbas tells the Palestinian people, if I'm left with only 1 penny in the coffers of the PA, I will pay it first, not to the needy, not to the medical staff, not to the teachers. I will pay it to the terrorists. That's Mahmoud Abbas's legacy. And sadly, many refuse to accept that.
Yeah, that's hard to believe, to be honest. Can you talk to us a little bit about the numbers? Do you have any idea how much the PA spends about the for the Pay for Slay, project.
And unfortunately, we have a good picture of the numbers, and it's disastrous. If we're talking about shekel, paying terrorists in jail and paying the other part of the paying the salaries, obviously, to the terrorists who have been released. The other part of the program is paying the families of dead terrorists. All in all, in 2020, the year of Corona, when the entire world was suffering, the global economy was suffering, everybody was looking for more ways to deal with how you help your population. The PA spent 750 million shekel paying rewards to terrorism. Instead of buying vaccines, instead of buying life-saving medical equipment, instead of building hospitals, investing in health, investing in welfare for the Palestinians who were now not working and needed a source of income. Mahmoud Abbas put his money where his mouth is.
And how do you think that's made possible? Who funds most of that money? Can the PA afford to do so because it's getting its funding, from the EU, the UN, UNRWA, whatever it is? Do we know where the money's coming from? We
know pretty much where the money's coming from. As part of our work at Palestinian Media Watch, I follow the PA financial records. Okay. So I know pretty much how much is coming in, how much they say is coming in from the different sources, from the different tax incomes that they have, from external international donations, and how much they're spending. And the answer simply to your question is obviously they can afford it because they're doing it. If it was a question of, do I pay the teachers this month or do I pay for slay to reward terrorists, then they would have a dilemma. What's more important, the next generation of children that they poison their minds or rewarding the terrorists? So it's almost like being a drug addict. If you're a drug addict, you have to make a decision with the 100 shekel or the $100 that you have in your pocket. Do I buy drugs or do I buy food? You can't have both. It's either drugs or food. So you either starve and have your drugs or have your drugs and not go through any of the side effects of missing out.
We can imagine what they'd choose.
So the PA, the drugs obviously is paying the terrorists. The PA chooses paying the terrorists, rewarding terror, rewarding the murderers of Jews. Why? Because the European Union pays for the salaries of the teachers. Anytime the European Union steps in and foots the bill of the needy Palestinians, the genuinely needy Palestinians, according to the Palestinian budget, there's about 118,000 families that are genuinely living under the poverty line. They need help. European Union steps in. The teachers need to be paid. European Union steps in. American contributions, which stopped under Donald Trump, go to that purpose. It's the understanding, the very, very basic, simple understanding that money is fungible. If I pay for something which is ostensibly banal, like education, the PA can then use its own money to fund rewards for murdering Jews. That's the equation. And simply understanding that is possibly part of the hardest part of our work at Palestinian Media Watch, explaining to the Europeans that when you answer to us that, well, you're only paying the salaries of people who work in education, that's fine, we understand that. But you're facilitating the paying of rewards for murdering Jews. And they don't care.
Let me ask you this about Israel, right? I know there used to be a law, it possibly still is, but is it enforced, where the security minister has the right to really cut off the tax money going from Israel to the PA for, the basically pay for slay money that the PA gives terrorists. Is that being enforced? Was it enforced? Where does it stand right now?
So that's a complicated subject. As part of a little bit of background, as part of the Oslo Accords, Israel agreed to waive a tremendous amount of taxes in favor of the Palestinian Authority, giving them money to function. Yes. We're talking about, in the last few years, somewhere in the region of 8.5 to 9 billion shekel a year, which is given to the Palestinian Authority. That's about half of their annual budget. That is the money that funds Pay for Slay, because that's the money that's their money. It comes in, and there's almost no strings attached. So in 2017, Elazar Stern, initiated, the member of Knesset Elazar Stern, together with Avi Dichter, initiated legislation that said that the amount that the PA had paid in the previous year to terrorists would then be deducted from the tax income in the following year. That law passed in July 2018. It passed with a huge majority. It is being implemented to a certain extent. Okay. To date, the cabinet, the security cabinet, the way the law works is that the Ministry of Defense submits a report saying how much the PA spent in the previous year. In many cases, they've adopted the reports of Palestinian Media Watch, and thereafter the security cabinet decides, approves the report, and then the money is taken off. To date, the security cabinet has approved the deduction of 1.2 billion shekel for 2018-2019. That was the sums that the PA had spent: 650 million shekel in 2018, 609 million shekel from January through November 2019, and that money is slowly being deducted from the tax income into a specific account of the Ministry of Finance.
Hopefully we'll continue doing so.
Yes, I hope so.
Now, when it comes to really certain accusations that we hear throughout the media against the Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria, a lot of people really accuse the communities of actually being illegal when it comes to international law. As someone who understands international law, can you tell us more about that? Do Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria are actually violating international law?
No.
Okay.
That's the short answer.
Yeah.
And the very simple answer, and an answer which everyone should understand, that is 100% the answer. The answer is no. I'll explain why. Okay. The argument that Israeli presence in Judea and Samaria, settlements, are illegal is based on the 4th Geneva Convention, Article 49, the 6th paragraph there, which prohibits an occupying power from transferring its civilian population into the occupied territory. That is the basis for the discussion. Is Judea and Samaria occupied territory? Occupied territory means that it was the sovereign territory of another country. Who was the sovereign in Judea and Samaria? No one. When Israel liberated Judea and Samaria, the country that had been ruling illegally, as defined really by the entire international community, illegally occupying Judea and Samaria was Jordan. Correct. From 1948 until 1967, it was under illegal Jordanian occupation. Prior to 1948, it was part of the British Mandate, which, as part of the British Mandate, if you haven't read the mandate for Palestine, the League of Nations mandate for Palestine from 1922, you've never read a Zionistic text in your life. And this isn't in Tirtzu, this isn't Herzl, this is the League of Nations, recognizing the historic connection of the Jewish people to the land of Palestine, including
Judea and Samaria,
including Judea and Samaria, obviously at the time, and also the East Bank, including Jordan. That was the text. Promoting the re-establishment of the Jewish homeland, not establishing de novo out of nothing, but re-establishing, recognizing that there had been a Jewish country here for over 1,000 years that had been destroyed, and now we're re-establishing that Jewish homeland. This is the text of the League of Nations.
No one seems to remember that, right?
No one likes to accept that. No one likes to accept that mandate was based on a meeting of the international community in April 1920 in San Remo, where the Allied nations, who had just defeated the Ottomans, the Germans, had taken apart the Ottoman Empire and were now dividing it up. All these countries that suddenly came into existence, Lebanon and Syria, and really redefining the entire Middle East neighborhood. Those countries got together and said, well, this area of Palestine is for the Jews. They're going back to the Balfour Declaration, the 2nd of November, 1917. That entire process is the basis for the existence of Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. International law and the international community gave that area to the Jews. The illegal occupation of the Jordanians did nothing to stop that title. And so when the Jews go and set up settlements in Judea and Samaria, they are returning to their ancestral homeland as given to them by the international community. The only thing that could have changed it was the partition plan, 1947, the UN partition plan, which the Arabs rejected. And so that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the claim that Israeli settlements, all of them, and the example always given is Hebron, is an illegal presence, is absolutely shameful. A Jewish presence existed in Hebron since the time of the conquest of Israel by Joshua. There's been a Jewish presence in Hebron. Hebron was the place where King David is usually associated with Jerusalem. King David's kingdom and kingship started in Hebron. The first 7 years of his kingship is in Hebron. The Jewish shul in synagogue in the neighborhood of Avraham Avinu in Hebron was built in 1540.
That's crazy.
We're not settlers in Hebron. Hebron is Jewish. And to say that the Jewish presence there, because the Arabs in 1929 murdered most of the residents of Hebron. The Jordanians finished the work and ethnically cleansed all of Judea and Samaria of all of the rest of the populations. I myself live in Gush Etzion and Efrat. The community of Gush Etzion was decimated, massacred by the Jordanian army as part of that ethnic cleansing during the War of Independence, during that illegal occupation. To say that the Jewish presence in Gush Etzion, in Hebron, is illegal because the Arabs murdered everyone and we came home is just a shameful argument. And it's something which international law simply doesn't support, despite all the arguments of these ostensibly learned people and the reference to the 4th Geneva Convention. Excuse my language, it's just bullshit.
So can you say, just a short question about that, would you say it's not ignorance by, coming from the international community, but more just the unwillingness to stand by Israel? Is it anti-Semitism? Is it just being pro-Palestinian? What's the reason for it?
So I tend to answer that question I'll try and give you a short answer. Yeah. There are 3 reasons why, for example, the Europeans can't understand what's going on in Judea and Samaria and the Israeli-Arab conflict. Firstly, the Europeans absolutely hate the idea of nationalism. They don't understand it. They understand what nationalism caused. It brought about the Second World War, destruction. That's Europe. That's the European Union. We're all living together, and this idea of separate nationalities is something which isn't good. So it's foreign to them. Most of the Europeans today grew up into that mindset that it's just impossible to understand anything else. The second idea is that we have a peace agreement. We signed documents saying that there's going to be peace. For the Europeans, they respect their signature, they respect their commitment, and they can't understand the idea that really what the Palestinian Authority tells its people all the time, that we can act like Muhammad. We can promise that we're going to make peace, but then the Hudaybiyah agreements, but really then we're going to go and attack, and that's really what we're doing. That's what Yasser Arafat said. And so that's something that the Europeans in general can't understand. And the third thing, which really links to the idea of, well, do the Europeans not understand the Balfour Declaration? Have they never heard of it? Have they never heard of the San Remo Conference? Have they never read the mandate? Do they not understand it? And there, unfortunately, we play into the third element of that discussion, rationalism of anti-nationalism, respect for yourself, which is just based on respecting your own signature, and the third element being hate the Jews. That's unfortunately the answer, because there's no other way to explain the willful blindness.
Yeah, exactly.
There's nothing that I'm making up. It's text which exists. It's text which every historian can read, every individual can read. And so how can you distort the reality into saying something which doesn't exist? A recent report talked about the 1967 borders for the Palestinian state. There are no borders in 1967. They are the armistice lines of 1949, which the Arabs demanded in the armistice agreements would never be seen as borders. So how can you distort history, distort truth?
That's exactly what they're trying to do.
The ICC prosecutor inventing this idea of the 1967 border. It's just a lie. She knows that it's a lie.
Incredible.
But so it's either willful blindness, which I don't think it is, or just simple Jew hatred.
Yeah. So let's take it to Israel's part in this. You know, a lot of people say, or at least complain, that Israel obviously doesn't have enough deterrence because of the pay-for-slave phenomenon, for example, or the lavish benefits, which I'm sure you're aware of, Palestinian terrorists enjoy in prison. You were talking about education, you know, completing degrees and things like that. What can Israel do, if at all, right, to increase its deterrence?
So I think there are a number of steps that really could be taken predominantly by the prosecution. Some of them I tried to implement, and some of them in general by Israel. First and foremost, ensure that small criminals get heavy sentences.
Even though they get the money from
Even
the
though
PA.
they get the money from the PA. In a second, I'll explain how we deal with that. Small terrorists, not necessarily minors, but minor terrorists, need to learn harsh lessons very, very quickly. If you have severe punishments for minor offenses, there's less chance that the terrorist will grow into the more serious offenses. That's unfortunately not the case. So if you have terrorists throwing rocks at Jews driving on roads, potentially murdering them, those terrorists shouldn't be receiving 6 months in jail. They should be receiving 3 and 4 and 5 years in jail for those types of offenses. The maximum sentences are 20 years, according to law. In other countries in the world, they have similar offenses.
So the law allows it. It's just a ruling that's different.
It's just not done. So that's the first thing, changing the way that we deal with the lighter. Again, like I said, when you have a murderer, he's going to get a life sentence or he's going to get 5 life sentences. That's less of a function. It's dealing with the lighter terrorists. That's the first part. The second part is making sure that as part of any punishment that's handed down, the defendant is given a fine. I'm a true believer in the financial aspects of dealing with terrorism. Nothing that I really invented. I took it from the Americans. How do you deal with Al Capone? You go after him for tax evasion. Money. It's all about money. When the defense lawyers came into my office as the head of the prosecution, they saw my screensaver, Jerry Maguire, show me the money. That's what I want to know. Money, 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 money. If you don't have money, then you can't promote terrorism. You can't carry out terrorist acts. You can't pay for the rewards that you promise to the terrorists. You can't fund defense lawyers for the terrorists. You can't give them that whole entire security blanket which they need in order to be persuaded to go into terrorism. Money. So you put into the criminal process a very simple function that says that every terrorist who's sentenced will get a fine which is equivalent at least to the sum that he's going to make in prison. And so you take away that financial incentive. If you're going to go to jail for 3 years and be paid 40,000 shekel, you get a fine of 42,000 shekel. Suddenly there's no financial incentive because you either pay the fine or stay longer in jail. There's no financial incentive. And so that needs to be done. The idea of house demolitions, I've seen dozens, if not scores of statements that support the idea that house demolitions of terrorists is a true deterrent. Mothers talking with without getting into too much detail, mothers talking to their children saying, well, if you carry out this offense, then they're going to come and destroy our house, and I can't tolerate that, and therefore I'm going to do what I need to do to save my house. Mothers and parents and fathers turning their children into the Israeli authorities for fear that their houses would be destroyed. Each one of those acts saves a life, saves dozens of lives. And there are dozens of incidents like that. That's something which has to be understood, and really that is the deterrent. Within that, Israel already destroys the houses mostly of the terrorists who murdered people. I believe also that the houses of those who attempted to murder people should also be taken into account and should also be destroyed, particularly those who did everything that was required of them or that they wanted to do, but for some outside intervention, the victim survived. The victim survived. Amazing people like, I don't know, Kay Wilson, an amazing story. She was stabbed over and over again, I think 13 times, and numerous broken bones. She dragged herself barefoot, having already played dead, to a road 500 meters away. She survived despite what the terrorists tried to do. Batia Label, a year and a half ago, stabbed repeatedly by the terrorists, amazingly, miraculously survived. Their houses were not destroyed because we only destroy the houses of the murderers. That really has no really inherent logic. You're trying to deter a terrorist from even trying to murder anyone, not from succeeding to murder someone. And so every one of those houses should also be destroyed. You have to also touch on the root causes of terrorism. That's part of the deterrent, making sure that incitement is dealt with in a forceful way and prevented, really. That's something that needs to be done and needs to be done on a much larger scale.
I see. And to try and just wrap it all up, let me try and ask you if you could really, pinpoint one main obstacle to peace in your eyes, right? Or let's say a solution, an ideal solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, in your opinion, what would you say?
So I think that the major obstacle to peace is the fact that the international community has a tendency to treat the Palestinian Authority, the PLO, the terrorists, Hamas even to a great extent, as a child having a tantrum, and to, instead of dealing with a child having a tantrum in the way that you're meant to do, to try and simply pacify them and explain to them, well, you're right for having a tantrum, you're right for being angry, you're right for murdering Jews, it's all the Jews' fault. That is that's the music that the Palestinian Authority hears every single day from the international community.
Agreed, yeah.
It's okay for you to murder Jews because it's all the Jews' fault anyway. I think that is the largest obstacle to peace. The Palestinian Authority hates Israel, hates Jews, would happily see every single one of the Jews living in Israel, including the left-wing Jews, murdered, thrown out of Israel, and Israel turned into another Arab country where they really implement the Nazi ideology of being Judenfrei, free of all the Jews. That's what the Palestinian Authority seeks to do. And so obviously that, I think, is the biggest obstacle to peace. How do you then get to peace? The road to peace is, I think, a difficult idea to grasp, but it has to start with dismantling the Palestinian Authority. It has to start with understanding the root cause of the problem. It's not the Palestinian. Even though I was a prosecutor for many years, I spent hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of hours prosecuting terrorists, and you see so many terrorists, and you think that it's all black. A lot of the Palestinian population, probably obviously the dominant part of the Palestinian population, simply wants to live their lives. They simply want to put food on their table, have their children grow up in a peaceful environment, let them go to school, let them get a good education, go to, I don't know, Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard,
like
go to the Hebrew U, just make money, live almost the American dream of having a Sunday when you can just like relax, hang out, chill, go and play some golf, enjoy the family time. That's I think what most of the population wants. And their leadership, the Palestinian Authority, is simply leading them to a path of hatred, kill, and be killed. There's no contribution to peace there. And therefore they are the obstacle.
And one last thing, do you think that the majority of the Palestinian population understands that? Because obviously you don't hear too much criticism going on from the inside, about the PA, but is this something that's at least being noticed, and perhaps they're waiting for a better time to be able to act on it?
Sadly, the Palestinian population is in a very, very, very bad position. And they have to choose. They hate the Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority is run by Fatah. Fatah is the party of Mahmoud Abbas. Fatah is associated inherently with corruption. The cronies who run the PA are all getting rich at the expense of the Palestinians on the street. Mahmoud Abbas has a personal fortune of hundreds of millions of dollars. The guy's never done a day's work in his life.
Yeah.
He didn't make hundreds of millions of dollars from selling his doctorate in Holocaust denial, and definitely not as the head of the PA. And yet he's accumulated this massive fortune. He's living almost on the backs of the Palestinian people. And so the Palestinian people understand that they are evil. Unfortunately, their only other alternative, real alternative, is Hamas. Yeah. And Hamas are these like Islamic fundamentalist nut jobs who just want to kill everybody. And so the choice is between evil and a little bit more evil. So the Palestinians really, there is no idea of, and this has to be understood about the Palestinian society and the Palestinian. It's not a free society. It's a dictatorship. Mahmoud Abbas is in his 17th year of a 4-year term. The Palestinian Prime Minister, Mahmoud Ashliya, runs around the world with his title of Prime Minister. He's never stood for election. He was just appointed by Abbas to be the puppet of the time. And the world panders to that. And so understanding that is I think fundamental, that people understand it, and they really have very little other choice.
I see. Well, that was a lot of food for thought, for me at least. Thank you so much for that, Maurice. Again, thank you much for joining us, and we hope to see you again here. And keep up your fabulous work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. If I can just again say that if you don't follow Palestinian Media Watch, so now's really the chance. It's palwatch.org. It's all of the information that I've been talking about the Palestinian society, pay for slay, everything, the education system. You can find it easily there.
Great point. Thank you so much again, and see you guys next time.